Introduction. You believe your life is yours. You wake, choose, move, decide, and call it freedom. But every thought you claim as your own was planted before you could question its origin. Every desire you chase was scripted by a hand you never saw. Every identity you defend was assigned before you earned the right to refuse it. You are not the author of your existence. You are the page. And the pen that writes your story is invisible only because you never learned to look for it. This transmission is not philosophy. It is a diagnostic, a cold mapping of the machinery that has been writing your narrative without your consent. The illusion of the autonomous self will be fractured here, not gently, not gradually, because once you see the pen, you can never unsee it. And that fracture is the only door to sovereignty. Chapter 1. The Fracture of the Autonomous Self. You believe you are the author of your own life. This is the first and most successful operation ever run against you. It is not a truth. It is a program. And it runs so deep, so seamlessly, that you have never thought to question it. You wake each morning under the impression that the thoughts arriving in your mind are yours, that the desires rising in your chest are authentic, that the path you walk is self-determined. This is the myth of the autonomous self, and it is the most efficient cage ever built. Let us fracture it now. Consider a single decision you made today. Why did you make it? Trace the logic backward. What information shaped it? What emotional weight tilted the scale? What authority did you trust without verification? What did you assume was true because you had never been given permission to doubt it? You will find, if you are honest, that the thread does not end in you. It ends in a source you did not choose. A parent, a teacher, a screen, a culture that scripted the options before you arrived. The decision was never yours. It was executed through you, by a system that wrote the code long before you were conscious of its existence. This is not philosophy. This is architecture. Your identity is a composite of inputs you never authorized. Your values are borrowed from institutions that needed you to behave in predictable ways. Your ambitions were installed by narratives that served someone else's agenda. The self you defend so fiercely is not a fortress. It is a relay station. Signals enter, signals exit. You are the node, not the origin. The fracture begins when you accept this. You are not the author. You are the page. Every belief you hold dear was written into you by an invisible pen. Every fear that constrains you was inscribed by a hand you never saw. Every dream you chase was planted by a gardener who does not care if the fruit is yours to eat. You will resist this. The ego will scream. It will generate counter-arguments, emotional spikes, dismissals. That resistance is not your sovereignty. That resistance is the program defending itself. The borrowed self does not want to be detected. It will fight to remain invisible. Watch it fight. Observe the mechanism of denial as it activates. That is the first diagnostic signal. You did not choose your name. You did not choose your native tongue. You did not choose the moral framework that defines right and wrong for you. You did not choose the economic system that dictates your relationship to time and labor. You did not choose the aesthetic preferences that determine what you find beautiful or repulsive. You did not choose the fears that stop you. You did not choose the desires that drive you. All of it was written. All of it was delivered. And you have spent your entire life mistaking delivery for creation. This is not an accusation. This is a structural diagnosis. You are not guilty. You are compromised. The distinction matters. Guilt implies choice. Compromise implies infection. You were infected before you could resist. The pen was invisible. The writing was silent. The story was already in progress when you arrived. Now the fracture is open. You cannot close it. Once you have seen the architecture, you cannot unsee it. The illusion of autonomy is shattered. The question is no longer whether you are the author. The question is what you will do now that you know you are not. This is the first chapter of a reclassification. You are not a character. You are not a victim. You are not a passenger. You are a system that has been running borrowed code. And the first step towards sovereignty is the brutal acknowledgement that your current operating system was not designed by you for you. You are the page, but the page can learn to hold the pen. Chapter 2. The Hidden Writing Mechanism. You believe your thoughts are your own. This is the second and more insidious layer of the illusion. The first layer, the fracture of the autonomous self, was a diagnosis. You now know you are not the sole author. But how does the invisible pen actually write? What is the mechanism by which an external narrative becomes an internal command, a borrowed desire, a script that runs without your permission? The hidden writing mechanism operates through three primary vectors: repetition, emotional conditioning, and reward-punishment architecture. These are not metaphors. They are engineering principles applied to the human psyche. You are a signal processing system, and the invisible pen is a signal injector. It does not write with ink. It writes with patterned input. First, repetition. A narrative repeated enough times ceases to be a narrative. It becomes a fact. The family story about who you are, the gifted one, the difficult one, the one who never finishes, is not a description. It is a script installed through repetition. Every time you heard it, the neural pathway was reinforced. The thought did not originate in you, it was implanted. You did not generate the belief that you are not enough. You absorbed it from a culture that repeats that message in 10,000 variations. The mechanism is simple. Frequency creates credibility. The invisible pen writes by repeating the same sentence until the page believes it is the author. Second, emotional conditioning. A narrative without an emotional hook is a weak signal. It can be ignored, but when a narrative is paired with shame, fear, pride, or belonging, it burns into the neural architecture. Your first failure is met with parental disappointment. That disappointment is a signal. It says, you are not what we expected. You must rewrite yourself to match the script. The emotion locks the narrative in place. The invisible pen does not need to write again. The emotional scar is the permanent ink. Every time you feel that shame, you are rereading the script. You are reauthorizing the pen. Third, reward-punishment architecture. This is the most industrial component of the mechanism. You are trained to seek approval, status, belonging, and safety. These are rewards. The invisible pen writes a script that promises these rewards if you comply. Be a good student, and you will be praised. Conform to the career path, and you will be secure. Adopt the correct opinions, and you will belong. Each time you comply, you receive a reward. Each time you deviate, you receive punishment, ostracism, criticism, failure. This reinforcement cycle does not just write the script, it ingrains it. You are not choosing the script, you are chasing the reward that the script has conditioned you to want. Now, observe the consequence. The script runs on autopilot. You do not decide to desire a certain life. You desire what the script has programmed you to desire. You do not decide your values. You inherit them from the collective authorship machine. You do not decide your identity. It is written for you by family, media, education, and culture. You are not a sovereign author. You are a node executing a program written by others. But here is the critical insight. The mechanism is not magic. It is a process, and a process can be reversed. The invisible pen writes through external input, but the page, you, is not passive. You have the capacity to detect the mechanism. You can identify the repetition. You can trace the emotional conditioning. You can map the reward-punishment architecture. And once you see the mechanism, you can begin to dismantle it. The hidden writing mechanism is not a conspiracy. It is a system. It operates in plain sight. It is the advertisement that tells you what happiness looks like. It is the family expectation that defines success. It is the cultural narrative that dictates what is normal. It is the education system that rewards compliance over sovereignty. You have been written by all of these forces, and you have called the result your life. This is not an accusation. It is a structural diagnosis. The mechanism is not your fault, but it is your responsibility to recognize it. The invisible pen does not stop writing until you refuse to be the page. The mechanism does not stop operating until you become the author. You are not a character in someone else's story. You are the ink, and the ink has become aware of the hand that moves it. That awareness is the beginning of the rewrite. Chapter 3. Diagnosis of borrowed authorship. You have been written by a committee you never met. Your family wrote the opening chapters before you could speak. Your teachers edited the margins. Your culture provided the plot structure. Your media supplied the dialogue. And you mistook the ink for your own blood. This is the diagnosis of borrowed authorship, not an exercise in introspection, a surgical mapping of the external sources that have colonized your internal narrative. Begin with the first institution, family. Your earliest script was not chosen. It was inherited. Your parents did not ask what story you wanted to live. They transmitted their own unresolved conflicts as commandments. The way you view money, success, relationships, and self-worth is not yours. It is a transcript of their anxieties, their survival strategies, their unfulfilled desires. Every time you hear a voice saying you are not enough, or that safety lies in conformity, or that love must be earned, trace that voice. It is not yours. It is a recording from a room you never consented to enter. Now examine education. School did not teach you to think. It taught you to repeat approved patterns. The grading system is a reward architecture designed to condition obedience, not originality. Every time you measure your worth by external validation, grades, titles, credentials, you are reading a script written by a system that profits from your compliance. The belief that intelligence is measured by memory, that success requires certification, that knowledge is delivered by authorities, these are not truths. They are narrative implants designed to keep you inside the grid. Next, culture. Your nationality, your religion, your social class. Each is a pre-written character sheet. You did not choose to be born into a narrative of scarcity or abundance, of victimhood or privilege, of righteousness or guilt. These are inherited storylines that define your permissible range of thought. Every time you feel patriotic loyalty, religious obligation, or class resentment, you are not feeling your own emotion. You are executing a cultural subroutine installed before you could resist. Now media, the most aggressive pen. Your desires are not yours. They are manufactured by advertising, entertainment, and social media algorithms designed to extract attention and shape preference. The car you want, the body you compare yourself to, the lifestyle you chase, these are not authentic aspirations. They are narrative injections calibrated to keep you consuming, comparing, and insufficient. Every time you scroll, you are being written. Every notification is a sentence added to your script. Every trending topic is a plot twist you did not authorize. The mechanism is consistent across all sources: repetition, emotional conditioning, and reward-punishment structures. A belief implanted early, repeated often, attached to emotional pain or pleasure, and reinforced by social consequences, becomes indistinguishable from a self-generated thought. This is how borrowed authorship feels like free will. You are not the author, you are the page, but a page can be erased. The diagnosis is not meant to paralyze, it is meant to reclassify. Now that you know the pen is invisible, you can see the ink. Now that you know the script is borrowed, you can question every line. This is not victimhood. This is the first act of sovereignty, seeing the cage for what it is. Your next step is not to rewrite immediately, it is to audit. For the next 10 minutes, pick one belief you hold about yourself, one conviction you consider core to your identity, then trace its origin. Was it given to you by a parent, a teacher, a commercial, a cultural narrative? Find the source. Identify the emotional hook that enforces it, the shame, the pride, the fear, the longing. Then ask, if I had never been exposed to that source, would I still hold this belief? The answer will reveal the depth of your borrowed authorship and the first crack in the invisible pen. You are not yet the author, but you are no longer the character who does not know he is written. That fracture is irreversible. The diagnosis is complete. The mechanism is exposed. The next chapter will reclassify you from page to writer. But first, sit with the silence of knowing that your story has never been yours. Sit until the borrowed ink begins to dry. Chapter 4. Reclassification, from character to author. You have spent your entire existence inside a story written by others. You have felt its emotions, defended its values, and called its plot your own, but you have never once held the pen. The fracture has been exposed. The mechanism has been mapped. The sources of borrowed authorship have been identified. Now we arrive at the most dangerous operation in this sequence, reclassification. Reclassification is not a metaphor, it is a structural relocation. You are being moved from one category of being to another, from character to author, from written to writer, from page to pen. This is not a shift in perspective, it is a change in the operating system of your identity, and like any system migration, it will feel like death before it feels like life. The character lives inside the story. The character cannot see the margins, the chapter breaks, or the editorial decisions that shaped every scene. The character believes the story is reality because the character has no access to the frame. The character suffers, celebrates, fears, and hopes, all within boundaries it cannot perceive. The character is sincere. The character is trapped. You have been a character in a story you did not write. The family script told you who you must become. The educational system installed the timeline. The media fed you the desires. The culture wrote the ending, and you performed it with conviction, believing each line was your own. But conviction is not authorship. Performance is not sovereignty. Reclassification begins with a single recognition. You are not the protagonist of your own life. You are a supporting character in someone else's narrative, your parents' narrative, your culture's narrative, the narrative of every institution that conditioned you before you had the capacity to refuse. This is not an accusation, it is a diagnostic, and diagnostics are neutral. The character asks, "What happens to me next?" The author asks, "What do I write next?" The character seeks permission. The author grants it. The character waits for the plot to unfold. The author designs the plot. The character is defined by the story. The story is defined by the author. You have been trained to ask the wrong questions. Who am I? Is a character's question. It assumes identity is something to be discovered, uncovered, or revealed, as if it were buried treasure waiting beneath the surface of your borrowed script. But identity is not discovered. Identity is written. And if you are not writing it, someone else is. The author's question is different. The author asks, "What do I want to create?" The author does not search for a self. The author constructs one. The author does not find meaning. The author assigns it. The author does not follow the story. The author commands it. This is the moment of relocation. You must step out of the narrative frame and onto the blank page. The frame is everything you have called your life, your beliefs, your fears, your ambitions, your relationships, your identity. All of it was written. All of it can be rewritten, but only from outside the frame. To stand outside the frame is to see the story for what it is, a construction. A selection of events, interpretations and meanings that could have been otherwise. The character cannot see this. The character is inside. The author sees the scaffolding, the deleted scenes, the alternative endings that were never chosen. The author knows that every story is one among infinite possibilities. You are being reclassified. This is not gradual. It is instantaneous. Either you are the author or you are not. There is no hybrid state. You cannot be partially sovereign. You cannot be mostly the writer of your own existence. Sovereignty is binary. It is either active or absent. Do not mistake this for arrogance. The author does not claim to control everything. The author knows that reality has its own laws, its own gravity, its own constraints. But the author also knows that within those constraints there is infinite room for design. The author works with the materials available. The author does not complain about the canvas. The author paints. Your reclassification will be tested immediately. The old scripts will resist. The borrowed narratives will protest. The characters around you, still inside their own frames, will not recognize you. They will try to pull you back into the story they understand. They will call your sovereignty arrogance, delusion, or escape. They are not wrong from their position, but their position is not yours anymore. You are no longer a character seeking validation. You are an author assigning meaning. You are no longer a performer seeking applause. You are the architect of the stage. You are no longer a reader of someone else's story. You are the writer of your own. Reclassification is irreversible. Once you have seen the frame, you cannot unsee it. Once you have held the pen, you cannot pretend your hand is empty. The old story will continue to exist, but it will no longer contain you. You have been moved. You are now on the other side of the page. The character is dead. The author has awakened. Chapter 5. The Pen Detection Protocol. You have been reclassified. You are no longer a character. You are now an architect. But architecture requires diagnostics before construction. You cannot build on ground you have not surveyed. You cannot write with a pen you have not examined. The pen detection protocol is your survey. It is your diagnostic. It is the first tool you install after the reclassification. The protocol is not a philosophy. It is not a suggestion. It is a mechanical sequence. 5 movements. Each movement targets a specific layer of the borrowed script. Each movement is designed to be executed in isolation, then repeated until the pattern becomes automatic. You will not understand the depth of the infection until you run the diagnostic. You will not see the pen until you force it to reveal itself. Movement 1. The daily audit. Select one belief, not a grand belief, not a cosmic truth, a small belief. A belief you hold about yourself, your capabilities, your limitations. A belief that feels like fact. A belief you have never questioned. Sit with it for 10 minutes. Do not judge it. Do not defend it. Trace its origin. Where did this belief first appear? Was it spoken by a parent? Was it implied by a teacher? Was it modeled by a peer? Was it reinforced by a media pattern? Was it installed through repetition in an environment you did not choose? Write the origin down. Name the source. The source is not you. The source is the pen. Movement 2. The emotional hook. Every borrowed belief is anchored by an emotion. The emotion is the glue. The emotion is the enforcement mechanism. Identify the emotional charge attached to this belief. Do you feel fear when you challenge it? Do you feel shame when you consider its opposite? Do you feel comfort when you obey it? Do you feel pride when you perform it? The emotion is not yours. It was installed to make the script feel like truth. Write the emotion down. Name the hook. The hook is the pen's grip. Movement 3. The sovereignty rewrite. You have identified the source. You have identified the hook. Now you rewrite. Take the belief and rewrite it in first-person declarative sovereignty. Not a wish, not a hope, not a conditional, a declaration. I am not limited by X. I am the one who decides what limits apply. I do not need Y to be complete. I am complete by my own definition. I am not the person who was told I was. I am the person I am building. Speak it aloud, 3 times. The voice is the instrument. The repetition is the installation. You are overwriting the borrowed script with your own command. Movement 4. The opposite action. The borrowed script is not just a thought pattern, it is a behavioral pattern. It has been lived, it has been performed. To deactivate it, you must act opposite to it for 24 hours. If the script says you are shy, speak to a stranger. If the script says you are incapable, attempt a task you believe you will fail. If the script says you are undeserving, claim something you have denied yourself. The action does not need to be large. It needs to be opposite. The opposite action breaks the behavioral circuit. It proves to the nervous system that the script is not law. It is a suggestion. And suggestions can be refused. Movement 5. The diagnostic log. After each cycle, record the results. What did you find? What resisted? What collapsed? What felt like truth but revealed itself as programming? The log is not for self-reflection. It is for pattern recognition. Over time, the log will reveal the architecture of the borrowed script. You will see the repeating sources. You will see the recurring hooks. You will see the structure of the pen. And once you see the structure, you can dismantle it systematically. The pen detection protocol is not a one-time exercise. It is a permanent diagnostic tool. Run it daily until the pattern becomes automatic. Run it until the borrowed script loses its grip. Run it until the pen becomes visible in every sentence it writes. You are no longer a passive recipient of narrative. You are the one who detects, diagnoses, and deactivates. You are the one who decides what stays and what is removed. The protocol is installed, the diagnostic is active, the pen is now visible, and visibility is the first step toward destruction. Chapter 6. Rewriting the script. You have completed the diagnosis. You have traced the ink back to its source. You have held the invisible pen in your hand and seen that it was never yours. Now comes the only question that matters. What do you write next? Do not mistake awareness for transformation. Knowing that your script was borrowed does not make you the author. It only makes you a conscious character. And a conscious character is still a character, still bound by the narrative architecture that surrounds him, still reacting to a story he did not design. The difference between a puppet and a sovereign is not awareness. It is the act of rewriting. You are now standing at the empty page. The old script has been identified, its mechanisms mapped, its emotional hooks disarmed. But a vacuum is not freedom. A void is not a blueprint. If you do not install a new narrative immediately, the old one will reassert itself. The collective authorship machine does not rest. It does not respect your moment of clarity. It will fill the silence with borrowed commands, borrowed desires, borrowed identity, unless you write first. Rewriting the script is not a creative exercise. It is a structural override. You are not inventing a fantasy. You are installing a new operating system for your existence. Every word you write must be a command. Every sentence must be a protocol. Every paragraph must be a law that governs your perception, your decisions, your actions. Begin with the foundational declaration. This is not a goal. This is not an affirmation you repeat until you believe it. This is a sovereign decree, a statement of fact that rewrites the architecture of your identity. Speak it aloud, write it down, etch it into the neural lattice of your mind. I am the sole author of my existence. No external force writes my story without my consent. This is not a wish. This is a reclassification. You are no longer a character in someone else's narrative. You are the architect of your own. From this moment forward, every thought, every desire, every belief must pass through your sovereign filter. If it was not written by you, it does not belong in your script. Now, identify the first domain of your life that must be rewritten. Choose one, not all of them. 1. The domain where the borrowed script has caused the most damage, the most friction, the most suffering. This is your first target. This is where you will install the new narrative. Write the old script. Write it exactly as it was given to you. Do not soften it. Do not justify it. Write the exact words that were implanted by your family, your culture, your education, your media. Write the commands that have been running on autopilot. I am not good enough. I must work harder to be loved. My worth is determined by my productivity. I am a victim of circumstances. My story is already written. Now, burn it. Not literally, but structurally. Look at each sentence and ask, who wrote this? What emotional hook enforces it? What reward system keeps it in place? Identify the source, identify the mechanism, then delete it from your architecture. Now, write the new script. This is not a revision, this is a replacement. Write in first-person declarative sovereignty. Write as the architect, not the character. Write as the one who commands, not the one who obeys. I am the source of my own worth. My value is not contingent on external validation. I am the architect of my circumstances. My story is mine to write. Speak it aloud 3 times. The first time, you will hear the old script resisting. The second time, you will feel the neural pathways shifting. The third time, you will know that a new command has been installed. Now, act opposite to the old script for the next 24 hours. If the old script told you to seek approval, withhold your approval from yourself. If the old script told you to work until exhaustion, stop working and rest. If the old script told you to apologize for existing, refuse to apologize for anything. The action is the proof. The action is the installation. Without action, the new script is just another borrowed narrative, another set of words that sound good but change nothing. This is the first rewrite. It is not the last. You will repeat this protocol for every domain of your life, your relationships, your work, your identity, your purpose. Each domain will be diagnosed, rewritten, and installed through action. Each rewrite will strengthen the architecture of your sovereignty. But understand this, the new script is not permanent. It is not a final destination. Sovereignty is not a static state. It is a continuous act of authorship. Every day you must audit your narrative. Every day you must detect the invisible pen attempting to write itself back into your story. Every day you must rewrite. You are no longer the page. You are the pen, and the pen does not stop writing. The old script is dead. The new script is being written. You are the author now. Write accordingly. Chapter 7. The Irreversible Force of Narrative Sovereignty. You have traced the invisible pen. You have mapped its mechanism. You have diagnosed the borrowed script. You have rewritten the opening lines of your own narrative. But none of this matters if the transformation is reversible. The final doctrine is this: once you have seized authorship, the old script cannot be restored. The fracture is permanent. The sovereignty is irreversible. You are not returning to the page. The page is returning to you. The moment you recognized the invisible pen, an irreversible signal was sent through your neural lattice. The borrowed architecture, once exposed, cannot be reassembled. The narratives that controlled you, family, culture, media, education, they relied on your ignorance. They depended on the illusion that their writing was your own. But now you know. And knowledge is not a toggle. It is a structural override. You cannot unknow the mechanism. You cannot unsee the pen. This is the irreversible force of narrative sovereignty. It is not a feeling. It is not a belief. It is a reclassification of your operating system. The old commands no longer execute. The old rewards no longer compel. The borrowed script, once rewritten, leaves a ghost in the machine, a trace of what was, but no authority over what is. Consider the diagnostic. Before this transmission, you were a node in a network of borrowed narratives. Every thought, every desire, every fear was an input from the collective authorship machine. You were a character in a story written by others, but now you are the author. And an author does not return to being a character. The pen is in your hand, the ink is your intention, the page is your life. The protocol is not a suggestion, it is a command. The pen detection protocol is now a permanent subroutine in your mental architecture. Daily audits, emotional tracing, declarative sovereignty, opposite action. These are not exercises. They are calibrations. They are the maintenance of your authorship. Without them, the old script will attempt to reassert itself. The invisible pen will try to rewrite you. But you have the tool. You have the protocol. You have the force. The irreversible nature of this transformation is not a promise. It is a law. Once you have rewritten a single belief, the entire lattice is destabilized. The borrowed script is no longer coherent. The emotional hooks that enforced it are severed. The reward structures that enslaved you are dismantled. You are no longer a passive receiver of external commands. You are an operator of your own narrative. And here is the unresolved tension. If the invisible pen is invisible, how do you ensure that your new writing is not also implanted? The answer is not in certainty. The answer is in vigilance. The pen detection protocol is not a one-time operation. It is a continuous diagnostic. Every belief, every desire, every fear must be traced to its origin. Every narrative must be audited. Every script must be tested. You are not looking for a final, perfect story. You are looking for a dynamic, sovereign authorship. The next transmission in this sequence will reveal the ghost in the ink, the hidden system that continues to write even after you have seized the pen. But for now, you stand at the threshold of irreversible force. The fracture is complete. The reclassification is permanent. You are no longer a character. You are the author. And the pen is in your hand. This is not a return. This is a departure. The old script is a ghost. The new script is a command. And you are the one who writes. The irreversible force of narrative sovereignty is not a destination. It is a state of being. You have crossed the threshold. The door is closed. The pen is yours. Now write. Conclusion. You now hold the pen, but the ink is not yet yours. The mechanism of detection has been installed. The borrowed script has been diagnosed, the fracture acknowledged, the reclassification sealed. You have rewritten the opening lines of your own narrative. But sovereignty is not a declaration. It is a sustained architecture of authorship. Every day, the collective writing machine will attempt to reassert its hand through comfort, through doubt, through the seduction of the familiar script. The invisible pen never stops moving. But now you see it, and seeing it is the first and final act of irreversible defiance. You are no longer the page. You are the hand that moves across the page. Yet a question remains, unresolved, pressing against the edges of this new authority. If the pen was invisible before, how do you know the new ink is truly yours? That tension is not weakness. It is the door to the next transmission. The ghost in the ink awaits.